So today I'm going to show you guys how to rebuild a differential assembly. Now, in the context of this video, I am dealing with a Ford 8.8 rear differential in a 2001 Mustang in this video. But the fact that I'm working on a Ford 8.8 is kind of irrelevant because once you start figuring out how these differentials work, they all sort of work kind of the same way. And really the only difference between a Ford 8.8 and a Ford 9 3/4 as far as rebuilding it is basically the bearing sizes and the specifications you're dealing with. The fundamental principles are all the same for pretty much any differential in a rear-wheel drive vehicle that's out on the market in 2024. So with all that in mind, as you would imagine, this video is going to apply to a bunch of different vehicles. So any half-ton truck, 3/4-ton truck, 1-ton truck, Jeep Wranglers, any off-road vehicles, things like that is going to have a differential, something similar to what I'm showing you here. Now with all that in mind, if you guys don't know what things like backlash, pinion depth, or bearing preload are, I'm going to have a separate video explaining the basics of a differential to try and get you guys up to speed, so then you can watch this video. If you guys don't know what I just said, like you don't know what backlash or bearing preload or any of those other things are, I'm going to have a card up in the corner right here. Go watch that video and then come back to this one. In addition to that, when it comes to checking the gear pattern on the differential, that's going to be another topic that you could spend between 8 and 15 minutes just talking about how to set up a gear pattern and what you really need to be looking for. So in the interest of time, because this isn't already a very long video, I'm going to have a separate upload for basically differentials 101, explaining the fundamental principles of what's going on here. And then I'm going to have another upload explaining gear patterns and how to make the adjustments, just because this video is already an hour long and I really don't want to make it any longer than what it is. So what I'm going to do for you guys is down below, I'm going to have different chapters. If you slide the red bar at the bottom, slide that back and forth, and that'll take you right to the correct portion of the video that you're looking for. That's all I can do to try and make this a little bit easier to digest, because believe it or not, when you boil this right down to its most basic form, there's 2 gears in here, and you will spend 8 hours controlling how 2 gears mesh with one another. So there's kind of a lot to this. So before we get started here, I'm going to take you over to the bench and just kind of show you some of the special tools that's involved in setting up a differential. And then we're going to get into tearing this thing apart and start rebuilding it. All right, so over here at the bench, these are some of the specialty tools that I'm going to be using in this video. Now, starting out over here on the left, this is going to be a set of aluminum bearing and seal drivers. The nice thing is about using an aluminum bearing and seal driver to drive in bearing races into a differential housing is it's virtually impossible to damage a steel bearing race using a piece of aluminum to drive it in. These will come in handy, like I said, for seals, bearings, other things like that. This set was relatively cheap. They're pretty easy to find online. I will have all this stuff linked in the description if you're interested in any of this stuff. The next thing I have here is going to be a bearing splitter set. Now, how you're going to use this tool is going to vary depending on whether or not you have a hydraulic press, but just know that you can use this tool with the provided adapters here to remove bearings off of your pinion, off of your carrier, and it makes differential disassembly actually very, very easy. Next thing I have down here is going to be a set of shim drivers. So depending on the size of axle housing you're working with will dictate what size shim driver you're going to need. This is the one that I was using for my setup. Honestly, you could make something like this. These are really just used to drive the differential carrier shims into place with a hammer and kind of help set your carrier bearing preload on your differential. Like I said, if you got creative, you can 100% make something along these lines without too much of an issue. But if you're rebuilding differentials on a somewhat frequent basis and you want to have the right tool, I'll have this link down below. Next thing I have here is going to be a pinion flange holding tool. So as the name implies, this goes on the pinion flange. It uses the original drive shaft bolts to hold it in place, and it gives you a way to adapt a breaker bar to your pinion flange so you can hold the pinion flange and tighten the pinion nut in the middle with another breaker bar to set your bearing preload on your pinion. These last three tools here are probably the most important thing out of anything that I have on the bench right now. First thing is going to be a dial indicator. You will 100% need a dial indicator to be able to read the differential backlash between the teeth to know that your differential is set up correctly. Next thing here is going to be a beam style torque wrench. You're going to use a beam style torque wrench to set the bearing preload on your pinion bearings. You can also use the old school dial torque wrench, but you cannot use like a click or an electronic torque wrench for what we're doing here. You need a beam style. Honestly, the beam style is going to be your cheapest option. Finally, the last thing I have here is a decent set of calipers. And what I'm using the calipers for is when I pull everything apart, I'm going to measure the shims on everything I pull apart and write everything down as I'm going. So as I'm going through and doing this, I'm obviously measuring the old shims that come out and I'm measuring the new shims that go in to know what my actual adjustments are. You're not going to be able to do this job without either a set of micrometers or a caliper like this. Now there are two special tools that I do not have on the bench here that I will be using in this video. First among which is going to be a hydraulic press. You may or may not need a hydraulic press depending on the style of housing that you're working on. And the second thing I'm going to be using here is going to be a hot plate. The nice thing is about a hot plate, you can buy them for relatively cheap on Amazon. They're between $10 and $20. And what you can do is you can heat up parts on the hot plate and cool other parts in the freezer to reduce the amount of press fit between the two parts that you're dealing with. So typically if you get them hot enough and you get them cold enough, the two pieces will just slide together. So to get started on disassembly, the first thing I got to do is I got to get the oil out of this thing, get this cover off. So that's what we're going to do. Now, part of the reason that I knew that I've got issues with this differential, if you notice the bottom of this cover has a sensor in it, and I wired that sensor to a gauge that I had on the dash. And I drove this car from my house in Akron out to California in the fall of 2022. And the differential in this car on that trip the whole time was running like 240 degrees. Like it was just nuclear hot the whole time. The only way that I could get the temperature under control was slow down below the speed limit. Like when I'm saying it was 240 degrees, it was 240 degrees at like 75 miles an hour. Like it wasn't like I was doing 140 the whole time. So it was pretty evident that I had something going on in here. And after I got home from the trip, I went and changed the fluid just to see what the fluid looked like, and the fluid was full of glitter. So here we are. I'm suspecting a bad pinion bearing, but we'll see. So I changed the fluid in this. This fluid has like 500 miles on it. So after I found the glitter in the oil, I put fresh fluid in it and I said, screw it, I'll just run it for the next summer. But it's pretty apparent that this thing has had some sort of major failure. From my understanding, I mean, the normal temp for one of these things, it shouldn't really be too much higher than about 200 degrees, maybe 220 if you're towing, but 240 sustained all the time is ridiculously high. So I don't know, it doesn't look too bad, but this fluid has 500 miles on it, guys, and like look at how dark it is in the bottom. All the metal settled out in it. So we'll see when we get this thing apart. I know this thing has had a bearing failure somewhere. It's just a matter of tearing it apart to find it. So the next thing I need to do here is I need to remove the axles so I can remove the ring gear and the differential. To get the axles out, I have C-clips on this axle, so I need to remove the brakes, remove the cross pin in the differential, and push the axle in to pull the C-clip out, and then the whole axle will slide out the end. Depending on the style of axle you're working on, it may be different. So for example, like the front end of Jeeps, like if you're doing a front end on a Jeep, the ring and pinion in those pretty much just pop out. Once you remove the wheel hub and the wheel bearing and all that stuff, those just pop out with a pry bar. Other ones have some sort of mechanism to retain the axle at the end of the tube. So really going to depend on what you're dealing with to be able to get these axles out of here. In any case, I have C-clips, so I got to remove my brakes. The way that I usually get these out of here, they're usually not that tight. It's just an 8mm bolt on this, so they're usually not super, super tight. I'll just grab a hammer, and usually I can usually get a little bit on it with the hammer, and once it starts to move, it's usually good. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this cross pin out of here. I get the cross pin out, then I can pull the cross pin itself, and then I can pull the C-clips. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to spin this ring and pinion around, and now I have to just slide this cross pin out, and it's feeling like it wants to come out the other direction. So spin this around. This should pretty much slide right out of here. So there's our cross pin. So now that the cross pin is out, what we can do, the spider gears in here now are loose, but what that allows us to do is we can push our axle in far enough that we can pull the C-clip out of there. So there's our C-clip, and now the axle should come all the way out. So now we got to repeat that for the other side. Push the axle in, pop out the C-clip. Now we can remove the ring gear, the differential itself, remove these bolts, those four, and this whole thing should pop out of there. You want to loosely leave those bolts in, because what you're going to find is this differential is a very slight press fit into the case. So what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to get in here with a pry bar and actually kind of pop this thing out of there. Well, if you leave the bolts in it, you're not going to pop it out onto the floor. So leave the caps loosely bolted on, and then I'm going to get behind here with a pry bar and just kind of wiggle this thing out of there. Everything that comes out of here, you want to put it back in the exact same spot. So there's going to be a shim over here on this side. There's also going to be a shim on this side to set the backlash between the ring gear and the pinion. That's going to remove the ring gear left to right and change the engagement with the pinion in there. What we're going to do is we're going to write down what this shim size is over here, what the shim size is over here. We're also going to mark this cap here, to make sure that this cap ends up back on this side facing the right direction. This cap over here ends up back on this side facing the right direction when we do final assembly. You cannot mix and match these caps. These caps are precision machined to this spot in the case. Essentially what they do here is they bolt these caps in and they run a drill bit through and machine this bore to run the axles through it. If you take this cap and you put it on the other side, it possibly could bind up the bearings, and you may fight the whole differential setup just because your caps are backwards. So you have to keep track of this stuff. So just to give you guys some extra evidence here that there is in fact something going on in this differential, if the metal in the oil wasn't enough for you, check out the backlash. I've never had this differential apart ever, and I can guarantee you it wasn't like this when it left the factory. So if you look, I'm just about 0 there, and I'm about 16. The backlash in this differential, I believe, is 8 to 12 thousandths, I believe is the spec. I'd have to look it up. But I can guarantee you one thing. It wasn't 16 or 17 when it left the factory. So there's obviously something going on in here for that backlash to be where it's at. So like I said, I'll show you guys later on how to settle this stuff up, but this is like a quick and dirty, easy thing to check. If you suspect you're having differential issues, just to go ahead and check the backlash. And if the backlash isn't in spec, well, there's got to be a reason why. When you guys pull this carrier out of here, the easiest thing to use for me was an indexable pry bar. I'm sure if you got creative with a traditional pry bar, you can get this thing out of here without too much of an issue. What you have to remember here, like I said a second ago, is this thing is a slight press fit into the case, and that press fit into the case is what sets the preload on the carrier bearings. So to get the pinion out of here, I've got a pinion flange holding tool with a ratchet, and then I'm just going to use an impact gun to zip the nut off of here. Shouldn't be a whole lot to it if you have a good impact gun. If you don't have a good impact gun, you're going to need a good breaker bar to get this done. Now the pinion is kind of like a press fit into the housing. So what I'm going to do, you can get a hammer and try to hit this on the face, like right here. You can normally come in here and that pinion should pop out the back side. What I'm gonna do is I've got an air chisel. I'm gonna use the air chisel with a point and just go right in the end of that pinion. I'm gonna keep the nut on it so it doesn't really like try to mushroom out on me. That's the thing, if you start really beating on the end of this without the nut on it, you'll mushroom the end of this out, and then you basically have to cut the end of the pinion off to get it out the back of the housing. And when you mushroom out that head, there's no way to get it back through without just cutting out or removing the part that's swollen up, because it actually goes through a couple of bearings to get out the back side. So it took me maybe 10 minutes to get this pinion out of here. It really wasn't stuck all that bad. I hammered on it, like I said, for a few minutes, and it pretty much popped out of there. So now that we got the pinion out, we got to get this pinion seal out and this inner bearing out. And to get the pinion seal out, my suggestion to you guys is just go around the edge with like a chisel and try to get a gap between the housing and the seal, and then sort of work it out. What I see a lot of guys doing, and I'm not a huge fan, is they'll get a pry bar like this and they'll come in behind it and they'll start pulling. What can happen is the corners of the pry bar could scratch that bore where the seal rides, and there's a potential you could create a leak that way. So if you guys want to get in here with a pry bar and just yank this thing out, go for it. But if it leaks when you get done, that's a possibility as to why. So I'm going to get in here with a chisel, kind of work this seal a little bit, pop the seal out, and then once I get the seal out, this bearing should just fall out. The only thing that holds it in really is the seal itself. So there you go, that is the last of the bearings. So this little washer is what's called, Ford calls it an oil slinger. Really what it does is it just keeps a lot of oil off the pinion seal. So you need this going back together. What I will say is if you don't put it in here, there's a potential you could create a pinion seal leak just because the pinion seal will be overwhelmed with oil. This just keeps some of that oil off the seal. The last thing we got to do to strip this housing completely is we have to get these old races out of here. You can't reuse the races. When you put in fresh bearings, you got to put in fresh races. So inside the housing, there's a couple little notches that you can get the punch into to try and start knocking out the race. And you're just going to work this back and forth, side to side, until those races pop out. It takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of effort, but shouldn't be that big of a deal. So one of the things that's optional for you to remove is going to be the kind of like the axle bearings here on the ends of the axle. This is going to be dependent on the style of axle you're working on. I'm changing them because, quite frankly, I'm in this far, and why not? So this is a special tool that goes on the end of a slide hammer. So the way this works is you fold this thing to the side, it folds back straight, and then that allows you to then hammer out the wheel bearing and the seal. I actually broke one of these on the passenger side, believe it or not, because I tried to do it with the seal installed. So I tried to remove the bearing and the seal all in one shot and broke the tool. So be mindful if your seals are stuck, maybe only do it one at a time, pop the seal out, and then do the wheel bearing by itself. All you got to do is pretty much just start hammering this thing out of here. And there you go. Before you start reassembly and start, you know, slapping the pinion in and setting pinion depth and all that stuff, you need to go through and you need to clean the housing. Especially if you've had any sort of bearing failure or a ring and pinion failure, anything that's going to introduce any metal contamination into the new ring and pinion, you need to get that stuff out of there. I will tell you guys, it's virtually impossible to get a housing too clean. One of the big failure modes of a differential like this is contamination. So if you don't get all the old garbage out of the housing, chances are in 5 to 10,000 miles, you may have issues with the new ring and pinion and bearing set that you're gonna put in here because you didn't clean everything correctly. To clean the housing, all I'm doing is I'm taking rags and I'm stuffing rags down the axle tubes, and I'm using a pry bar to push the rag down the tube. So all my garbage and dirt and contamination is going to end up in the pumpkin, and then I'm just going to clean out the pumpkin. When you clean out the center section, the pumpkin, clean out this cavity up here, because if you look, there's a hole up here, and what this does is when the cover is installed, the oil actually slings along the back of the cover and gets thrown into this cavity to lubricate the pinion bearings. So there's a potential you could have metal contamination up in this hole up here that if you don't clean it out, you're essentially going to fry a brand new ring and pinion and set of bearings, making you have to do this job all over again. So like I said, it's impossible to get the housing too clean. To clean the housing, a lot of guys will use, like, you know, a case of brake cleaner. I do things a little bit differently. I use engine degreaser, specifically a petroleum-based engine degreaser like this Gunk Original. The nice thing is this stuff doesn't evaporate like brake cleaner, so when I spray this in the housing, I can work it in with a paintbrush and it doesn't really go anywhere for a long period of time. So it's essentially a great parts cleaner if you need to use it as a parts cleaner. And then what I'll do is I'll follow it up with a light spritz of brake clean just to remove any residue, and then I've used a quarter the amount of brake cleaner that somebody else would. So, all right, so back over at the bench with my original ring and pinion, I wanted to show you guys some of the stuff that I found once I started investigating what was actually going on here. Now, bear in mind, I've owned this car since 2007. I bought this car with like 22,000 miles on it, and it currently has 80,000 miles on it. I've never been into the rear end of this car at all, other than to change the oil once or twice. So I found some stuff that's here that's kind of intriguing. So the first thing that I noticed was this pinion race, or I should say this carrier race. If you notice, that thing's all galled up. There isn't too much wear on the bearings themselves, but I'm gonna have to cut this cage off of here and do some investigation on the inner race to see if the inner race looks like this outer. The strange part is the other side of this carrier over here, the wear looks perfectly normal. So I'm not sure what went on this passenger side of this differential carrier, but at any rate, something happened because this race is clearly galled up. The next thing I found was something I wasn't expecting either, and the reason that I'm so intrigued by it is the two pinion bearings. So this outer pinion bearing here, this is a Timken part, okay? This inner pinion bearing is a Koyo. I've never seen a vehicle from the factory that has two different brands of pinion bearing. Perhaps some of you guys can fill me in onto what's going on here. Maybe this thing was a part before I owned it. You know, when it had less than 20,000 miles on it, perhaps it went in for some sort of warranty repair and they put in a Timken bearing to replace the Koyo. I just thought this was really, really strange that Ford from the factory would use two different brands of pinion bearing on the same pinion. Now, if you guys are simply just replacing bearings, all you really need to do is cut the bearing cage off, pull the cage off, and then simply cut the inner race as well. Once you have a line or a crack in that inner race, it'll pretty much just split and fall off of there without too much of an issue. You can do that to the bearings on the carrier. You can also do that to the bearings on the pinion. In my case, I need to know what size my old pinion shim is. So what I'm using here is I'm using a bearing splitter to pull off my lower pinion bearing so I can find out what size pinion shim I need for my new ring gear to go back together. All right, so I'm getting ready to start assembling the new pinion with the new pinion bearing. Obviously, before I do, you want to get the correct size pinion shim and put that on the pinion before you press the bearing on. Now the pinion shim that you're going to start out with is the pinion shim size that you took off of the old pinion. If you are assembling a bare housing and you do not know what size this pinion shim needs to be, you need to do some Google searching and some looking around on the internet to figure out what size shim people used for your differential. For a Ford 8.8, kind of the standard is like a 30 thousandths. That's kind of a very good starting point, would be a 30 thousandths pinion shim. This pinion shim I have here is a 22 thousandths. In any case, what you're going to do is you're going to put your pinion shim on, and then you are then going to install your bearing. Now, the bearing, just like removing it, it is a press fit. What I did was I bought a second pinion bearing, and what I'm doing is I'm actually hogging out the inside of this pinion bearing so it's no longer a press fit with a die grinder. So I can change this pinion shim very, very easily by simply lifting off the bearing, putting on a different shim, putting the new bearing back on, and throwing it back in the housing. Yes, it's going to cost me, obviously, the cost of whatever this bearing is, but it's going to save me a ton of time. And the other thing you have to remember here, guys, these bearings do not like to be pressed on and off like 3 and 4 times. So yes, I'm technically ruining this bearing, but it may save me from buying 3 more bearings in this whole procedure. So what I'm using for this is just a die grinder with a flap disc. Come in here. And it'll probably take maybe 5 minutes or so. I saw like a 4 thousandths interference fit between the ID of the bearing and the OD of the bearing area on the pinion. So I need to grind off about 4 or 5 thousandths on this pinion bearing to make it just slide on there. Now what I need to do is I need to get the ring gear onto the differential itself. And the way that I'm gonna do that is I'm actually gonna use a hot plate. So I'm gonna heat up this ring gear on this hot plate and let this thing sit for probably 15 minutes on the hot plate. And then what's gonna happen is that ring gear will just drop right onto the differential. What you'll find is there's a slight press fit between the ring gear and the differential. A lot of guys will pull them in with bolts. And I'm gonna tell you guys, that's a great way to strip out the holes in the ring gear, ruining the ring gear and costing you a ring and pinion assembly. So heat it up on a hot plate. I've seen guys use a press to press these on. I like using the hot plate, guys, just because, first of all, this hot plate I think was like between $10 and $20 on Amazon. They're super, super cheap. And for somebody that doesn't have a press, this is a great option for installing bearings. This hot plate also worked excellent for transferring my ABS tone rings over to my new axle. I just heated up the tone ring on the hot plate, dropped it right on the new axle, waited for it to cool down, and it was a nice press fit. So it's probably been, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. We'll see if this thing's gonna fit on here. I just got some welding gloves. And there you go. It fit all the way down on the base. So there you go, guys. It just slid right on there. Just use a hot plate. That's gonna be kind of the safest way to get that ring gear mounted. All right, so I apologize for the lighting, but this is down in my basement. I am using a Harbor Freight hydraulic press to press on the new carrier bearings onto the differential itself. Now, the way this works is there's a slight interference fit between this dimension and this dimension. What that means is the inside diameter here is actually smaller than the dimension, the outside dimension here. So you can 100%, you could take the bearing, put the bearing on the hot plate, put the differential carrier in the freezer to try and reduce that press fit so the bearing will slide on easier. I'm not doing that in my instance because I am using retaining compound on the carrier itself. So what retaining compound is, you put a little bit of retaining compound on this outer dimension here and press on your bearing. And this stuff is essentially Loctite for press fit parts. So all of my press fit parts during final assembly will be getting retaining compound to ensure that I'm not going to have any issues in the future. The reason that I can't use the hot plate with the retaining compound is the retaining compound is only good to 350 degrees, and I'm going to heat it up much hotter than that to slide this new bearing on. So I may burn off the retaining compound when I go to put the two parts together because of the heat I'm dealing with. So because of all of that is why I'm using the press. As far as pressing, you're just going to set the bearing here on top. I'm using my old race, and the old race works perfect to adapt the new bearing to the press itself. But the nice thing is I'm only pressing on this inside dimension right here. I'm not putting any pressure on the cage itself. If you put any pressure on the cage, you will destroy the bearing. So you only want to put pressure on this inside dimension there. You see there's two pieces of metal. Only put pressure on the inside one. That's why I'm using the old race. To get the old race adapted to the press, I'm using a 38 millimeter socket, so my setup's going to be something like that, and then I'm just going to use the press to press on the new bearing. Now, as I'm pressing these bearings on, the biggest thing you have to watch here is you have to make sure these bearings are going on straight. Make sure everything's nice and straight when it goes on, because once it starts going on cockeyed, you really can't fix it without pulling the bearing back off and trying over again. The other thing that you'll notice here is as I'm pressing, I'm also spinning the cage on the bearing. So if the cage is not able to spin as I'm pressing the bearing on, I am putting pressure on the cage. You do not want to put pressure on the cage. So spin the bearing by hand a little bit as you're pressing, just to make sure that everything's going on as it should, and try to keep everything straight. All right, so right now, use the press to your advantage, because if you guys remember, I did not torque any of these ring gear bolts when I put this ring gear on. I just zipped them in here with an impact, right? Well, now that I have this thing set up in the press, I'm using the pressure of the press to hold this whole assembly in place, so I can go ahead and torque all these bolts without having to get creative with a pry bar, or needing to have a giant bench vise to clamp this whole assembly in, anything like that. The press is holding everything, so now I can go through and I can torque all this hardware without any issue, as long as my press doesn't move. As I'm going through here and doing this, I'm going to mark each one of these fasteners just so I know which ones I've done and which ones I haven't. Okay, so our carrier bearings are all pressed on to the differential carrier itself. All of my ring gear bolts are tight. The pinion is ready for initial setup, and we're ready to try it. There's one last thing we have to do before we can put the pinion in and start setting preload. We have to put the new races into the differential housing. All right, so over at the housing, make sure your housing is completely spotless. Be willing to eat your next meal off the inside of the housing before you start assembly. Now, those races are gonna go in this bore, and you want to make sure that there's no crud in that bore, so that race seats nice and flush against that hard edge you see back there. If you have a gap between the housing and the race itself, it's going to throw off the pinion preload. The bearings are going to wear unevenly. You have to make sure that that race goes in there nice and square, and there's no contamination on that hard edge that the race is going to seat against. So that's what we're going to do now. I'm going to do one final wipe out with some brake clean, make sure the housing is as clean as possible, and then I'm going to start hammering in my races, and then we're going to start sending pinion preload. Now, to drive these races in, I'm using a set of aluminum bearing and seal drivers. The nice thing is about using a dedicated bearing and seal driver like this is because it's made of aluminum, it is much softer than the race itself. So it is virtually impossible to damage the bearing race with a softer material than the bearing race itself. So as I'm pressing these things in here, it's kind of like pressing on the carrier bearings. Just make sure everything is going into the housing straight. If it's not going into the housing straight, tap it back out with a punch and try it again. You have to make sure that this stuff is in here nice and square and as it should. Once you have it, what you think is in there all the way, we're going to check and make sure that these races are actually pressed into the housing to the correct depth. So once you have the race in here, go grab a feeler gauge, and you're going to take the smallest feeler gauge that you have. This one is a 2/1000 feeler gauge, and what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get this feeler gauge between the race and the housing. If I can get the feeler gauge between the race and the housing against that hard edge that the race is supposed to seat against, the race is not in all the way. If the race isn't in all the way, you're going to have a premature failure. So you want to check it with a feeler gauge in the back here. Just get the feeler gauge in and try to measure between the housing and the race to make sure you don't have any gaps in here. And then, as you would imagine, you're going to repeat that process for the other bearing race in the housing. So you're going to slide the pinion in from the back side. Put that in like so. Get your crush sleeve, slide your crush sleeve in. Then you're going to take your front pinion bearing. That should pretty much just slide on, something like that. You put your oil slinger back in. And then finally you can mount the drive shaft flange. So that's going to go in there something like that. And then you're going to secure everything with your nut. So I've got a couple of these pinion nuts. So I'm using a new one just because I have so many spares that there's no reason for me not to use a new one. But for final assembly, make sure you're using a fresh pinion nut. So if you only have one new pinion nut, use your new pinion nut on final assembly, not just checking preload like I am. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and tighten up the pinion nut while holding the pinion flange, with the breaker bar. Guys, what you'll find here is when you first put this pinion into the housing, it's going to be super, super loose. I'm going to draw this thing up with an impact until I get this slop completely out of it. Once it starts getting tight and there's no more free play in here anymore, at that point is when I'm going to start tightening the nut by hand. And what you're going to find is the closer that you get to the preload spec that you're looking for, the less movement you need to do on the pinion nut. So right there, I'm starting to crush the crush sleeve. I can tell just by the way the tone of the impact changed. I'm gonna keep hitting it a little bit. Still got some slop. Still got slop. Like the amount of force it takes to crush that crush sleeve, guys, it's gonna be hundreds of foot-pounds. It takes quite a lot to get that thing to crush. So just keep checking this thing, keep wiggling this pinion. Once you get the slop out of it, stop using the impact. We're getting close. There, so the slop is gone. Now at this point, you can see there's no preload on that. You see how that pinion keeps spinning? When this pinion has the right amount of preload, it's gonna have some drag on it. Like it's not just gonna free spin like this. But you can see right there, I've got all that slop out of the assembly. So now at this point, I'm starting to set the preload. So I'm gonna get a big ratchet, get my breaker bar all set up, and I'm gonna start cranking the snot out of this nut until I get the right preload here. So right there, guys, you can see it's got some preload on it now. You see how it's not just, you see how it stops rather quickly compared to what it did just a second ago before I tightened the nut? At this point, I'm gonna check my preload. Okay, so to measure the rotational torque or the resistance on the pinion, therefore the preload, we're going to use a beam style torque wrench. This is a little 1/4 inch torque wrench designed for inch pounds. The specification we're looking for here, according to Ford, with new bearings, like what I'm using here, is gonna be 16 to 28 inch-pounds. So I was kind of shooting for 20 just because I knew that if I got it to 20, I knew I was over 16 and I was less than 30. So this thing, I'm gonna tell you guys right now, it's kind of hard to read just because this thing is moving, right? But what you're trying to do here is, if you notice, when I first get this thing moving, this gauge goes much higher than what it does under constant motion. So watch, right there. You'll see, like if I hold it right at the point that it's kind of stopped, it reads much higher than what it does if I just move this constantly like this. What you want is you want constant motion just like this, and that's at the point where you should read this rotational torque. So if it's like jumping around and doing this, you're not reading it right. It's got to be under constant motion, nice and smooth, and that should give you a pretty good idea of where you're at. Mine, like I said, is about 20 inch-pounds. I'm hoping you guys can see that. The thing is, it's under motion, so it's very, very hard for me to get a fixed shot of what my actual reading is. But you guys will be able to figure it out. After you do this 3 or 4 times, you'll be able to see, okay, you can feel the point that it breaks away, and you'll feel the increase in resistance, and once it starts moving, you'll feel the resistance go down. And when that resistance goes down, when it's under constant motion, that is how you want to take this reading. Still light, just barely registering on the torque wrench. Yeah, that's roundabouts 5 is what I'm seeing here. At this point right here, guys, this is the perfect analogy of why you need a certain level of patience to be able to rebuild a differential. I'm at 5 inch-pounds on preload right now, and what you're gonna find is to go from 5 to 25 is gonna be extremely hard to do. And what I mean by that is it's gonna not take very much on the adjustment nut, or the pinion nut I should say, to increase the preload to like 25 inch-pounds from 5. So the amount that you need to move the nut is extremely, extremely small to get a large change. To get the nut to move at this point takes a ton of input torque with the ratchet. So when you do this, you have a tendency to over torque the pinion nut and go too far on your adjustment just because this nut is so hard to turn. That took it to about 10. That's about 17 or 18. All right, so at this moment, I have between 16 and 18 inch-pounds of rotational resistance on these pinion bearings. The specification put out by Ford is 16 to 28. I would like to be over 20 if I could, that way I know that I'm good. And with the gauge that I'm using, or the torque wrench that I'm using, it's getting a little bit hard to decipher whether I'm at 16 or whether I'm at 18. So I figure if I'm 20 or slightly above 20, I should be good to go. So this is when it gets real interesting, because this is when people tend to overshoot things. You know, it's usually, you know, you're trying for just a little bit more, and that's when you end up screwing something up. So I did get a little bit out of that. You see that? Like it's like 50 inch-pounds to get that thing to break free. And there, I overshot it. It's at 30 now. So just that little bit, guys, I went from 16 to 30. Yeah, it's too high. So now I got to take the whole thing back apart again and try it with a fresh crush sleeve. Now, I didn't record my second attempt of getting the preload set correctly, but it came in right about 20 inch-pounds. So once you get your preload set, then you can go ahead and put your ring gear and your carrier assembly back into the case. I'm going in with the original shims that came out of the left and right side just to see where I'm actually going to end up here. The thing is about putting this thing into the case, it is a bit of a wrestling match because you're trying to hold, obviously, the carrier, the ring gear. There's 2 races on each side for each bearing that have to go in, and the shims all have to go into this case at the exact same time. So as you would imagine, if you're doing this on your back, it's going to be a bit of a fight to get this thing in and out of here. And in addition to that, with these shims on each side, this assembly is a slight press fit into the case. Now, just how we set the pinion bearing preload, the thickness of the shims on either side is what sets the carrier bearing preload. So in addition to this thing weighing about 40 pounds, it feels like, holding it up over your head, dealing with the shims, it's then a press fit into the case. So as you guys are pulling this stuff apart, I highly recommend that you just take a notepad and you start writing down what some of these shim sizes are. So for example, like my driver's side shim, I have written down as a 280 thousandths, passenger side was a 274 thousandths, and my pinion shim was a 22 thousandths. So as I'm going through and I'm doing my different setups to try and get that gear pattern the way that I want it, I have everything documented. So if I get like 4 or 5 revisions in, I know where I came from, right? So if I look at my new pattern and my old pattern was better, I can go back to that very easily because I have all this written down. The other thing that you need to pay attention to here is the thickness of the carrier shims on the driver's side and the passenger side. When you add those 2 shim thicknesses together, in my case, that gives me 554 thousandths. So going forward, to maintain my correct carrier bearing preload, the total shim thickness on my driver's side and passenger side has to maintain 554 thousandths to have the correct carrier bearing preload. Now, if you are assembling a bare case and you do not know what the carrier bearing preload is or what these shims were, there is a way that you can figure it out. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the total preload with the carrier installed. You're going to minus the total preload minus the pinion preload. So in my case, that was 27 was my total preload. I had 22 on my pinion preload. You then times that by the gear ratio that you're dealing with. So I have 5 times 410. That gives me a carrier bearing preload of 20.5 inch-pounds, which should be about right. This number obviously is going to vary depending on the differential that you're working with, but like I said, guys, writing this stuff down is going to help you greatly, the further along you get into this process. So I've got the carrier all put up into place. I've got the factory shim sizes in the passenger side and the driver's side over here, and now we have to check the backlash. So what the backlash is essentially is the backlash is the pinion gear and the ring gear up front, how tight those 2 gears are with one another. So if there is a lot of backlash, they're going to be like this. If their backlash reading is very tight, the gears are meshing like this. So you're essentially controlling the distance between the 2 gears and how they're meshing with one another. Now, so to do this, you have to have a dial indicator. So you need to set a dial indicator up on the housing, and you have to have the dial indicator essentially parallel with the teeth on the housing. So don't come in here and try to read it horizontally like this, because you need to be perpendicular to the tooth to get an accurate reading. As you guys can see there, I've got about 15 thousandths or so, and the specification for this vehicle is 8 to 12. So I am outside the window for backlash using my factory shims. So what that means is I have to start moving some shims around in order to tighten up the backlash to get it to where it's supposed to be. All right, so as I just showed you guys, what I have to do here is I have 15 thousandths worth of backlash on this ring gear. I need to make the ring gear tighter against the pinion gear in order to decrease the backlash. The way that you move the ring gear in tighter with the pinion is by adjusting the shims here on each side. So in order for me to decrease my backlash, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove a shim from the right side, and I'm going to take that shim or another shim and put it in the left side. So what that's going to do is that's going to shift this whole carrier assembly over to the right, and it's going to engage the pinion gear more tightly, thereby reducing the backlash. For those of you that have, let's say, a Ford 9-inch or some Toyota products, those have a removable center section. Those differentials that have a removable center section typically do not use shims like this. What those use are actually like a big adjuster nuts that you would turn the adjuster to either move the carrier left or right. So in that instance, I'm removing a shim from here and putting it over here. You're kind of doing the same thing with one of those style. All you're going to do is you're going to loosen the carrier nut on this side and tighten the carrier nut on this side, and it's going to just do the same thing as me removing these shims. So before I can check any gear pattern, I have to get this backlash setting correct before you can even consider putting any paint on these gears to see if I'm actually meshing correctly. All right, so after making some shim adjustments, you can see it is different. I'm seeing between like 11 and 12. 8 to 12 is the specification, so I'm just on the outside of the spec. But because I don't know what my pinion depth is, I'm gonna go ahead and run a pattern. Okay, so to check the gear pattern, you're gonna get some gear marking compound. It should come with the kit that you're using, and you're just gonna paint a couple teeth. Now what I do is I will cut the gear marking compound, so if you look, it looks a little thin. I'll cut it with some gear oil just to thin it out a little bit, help it spread a little bit easier. They really don't give you a whole lot in these kits, but then again, you really don't need a whole lot. I've seen pictures of people painting the entire ring gear. You really only need about 3 or 4 teeth in maybe 2 locations. All right, so once you get some paint on this thing, put your hand in here and put some drag on it with your hand, and that'll help you get a good pattern. What I'm just using a really small ratchet to turn the pinion, and that should get us, put some drag on it with this hand, turn it over, and there you go, I got a pattern. So you got to do it in both directions. You want to look at the drive side and you want to look at the coast side. So spin this thing backwards, doing the same thing. And there you go. I've got a pattern on both sides. Now we can evaluate the pattern. We can evaluate this overall setup on the differential and what adjustments do we need to make from here. So taking a look at the 2 gear patterns that you see on the screen, the one on the left is what I started with, and the one on the right is what I ended with. And the only difference between these 2 patterns, if you'll notice, the tooth engagement on the pattern on the right is a little bit better or a little bit deeper than what it is on the left. And really what that difference equates to is simply the thickness of the pinion shim. I'm going to have a completely separate upload on how to analyze gear patterns like this because, frankly, you can look at 200 different gear patterns and they're all going to be slightly different from one another. So there's kind of a lot to this, and really what you need to know here is based on the gear pattern that you see after you have the whole thing assembled, that is what is going to dictate any shimming changes that you need to do. So what that means is, if you want to make a shimming change to the pinion, you have to tear this whole thing back apart again, pull everything back apart, pull your setup bearing off, change the shim underneath the setup bearing, reset your pinion bearing preload, put the carrier back in, reset your backlash, and run another pattern. So this is why I told you guys really need to write down some of these shim thicknesses that you're dealing with, just so you're not doing the same thing over and over and over again. If you have a log on a piece of paper showing you all the different shimming changes that you made to this differential, at least that way you know you're not going to have the same shim combination come up. And if you find a combination that works better than what you currently have, you can go right back to it. So at this point, guys, I'm going to show you guys how to do final assembly, but just know at this point, based on the pinion pattern and the gear pattern that you're seeing here, you may have to take this assembly apart like 3 or 5 times to get this gear pattern the way that it should be. The other quick thing that you need to note here as well is the type of gears that you're using. It will very much change the type of pattern that you're looking at. So frankly, if you bought a crap set of ring and pinion gears, you may have problems adjusting your pinion pattern and your ring gear pattern to get them where they should be because your gears are cut wrong. When the manufacturer of your gear set is telling you to take a die grinder to your brand new ring and pinion because they can't be bothered to deburr anything, yeah, that's probably not the greatest ring and pinion in the world. So probably don't buy Yukon. So now that I know what shims I need for my setup, I'm going to write all this stuff down, and now I'm going to go ahead and do final assembly. So for final assembly, really the only difference is I'm actually pressing on the pinion bearing to the pinion, versus on setup, I was using a setup bearing so I could easily change the pinion shim. All right, so back down at the press, I've got pretty much every single race that I pulled out of this differential stacked on top of one another with a socket on top to give me enough distance that I can push this pinion bearing on here. Obviously, make sure your correct shims are underneath the pinion bearing and just start pressing this thing on there. Always make sure that cage spins. Whenever you're pressing something, if the cage is spinning, you're doing what you're supposed to do. If the cage doesn't spin, you're pushing on the cage itself and you're causing damage to the bearing. Almost forgot my retaining compound. I'm going to put a little bit of retaining compound down here at the bottom. That's it. All right, now at this point, I'm ready to do final assembly of the pinion. Obviously, you guys saw I just got the pinion bearing pressed on here. Everything's good to go here. Now, ordinarily, you would install a crush sleeve, a fresh crush sleeve, and then go ahead and set your pinion preload as I showed you how to do earlier on in the video. Now, what I am actually using a solid spacer rather than a crush sleeve. I think this ran me about 50 bucks, $60, but they come with a ton of different shims. So rather than me crushing down this crush sleeve with the pinion nut, what I do is I simply set this spacer to the thickness that it needs to be. And just assume that you're gonna spend 45 minutes to an hour screwing around with this thing to get this set up correctly. So what you guys really need to know here is this. If I take these 2 pinion bearings and put them on the pinion, if I remove shims out of this spacer, it's gonna make these 2 pinion bearings closer together. If you make the pinion bearings closer together, it's going to increase the pinion preload. If I add shims to this stack, it's going to take the bearings and pull them further apart. That is going to decrease the pinion preload. To give you an idea of how sensitive shimming changes are on this pinion, guys, to go from 5 inch-pounds of pinion preload to 22 inch-pounds of pinion preload, it took a 0.002 shim, or a 2,000 shim, took it from 5 to 22. So this is what I'm saying, guys. If you're going to use one of these, just be patient with it. The big advantage to using a solid spacer like this over a crush sleeve is these are much more durable. The reason for that is what you have to remember is when this pinion is in the housing and spinning, because these gears are cut on an angle and these are not straight cut gears, these gears create thrust. And what that means is as the vehicle's trying to accelerate, it's trying to pull the pinion forward or backward depending on whether the vehicle is accelerating or decelerating. Well, what ends up happening is if you accelerate extremely hard, or you shock load the drivetrain like you like to do rock crawling, what ends up happening is you will crush the crush sleeve just based on that amount of thrust that is put into the case because of the angle cut on the gears. So these shims, the shim style is much more durable than a crush sleeve. The other advantage to this shim style over a crush sleeve is, let's say 20 years from now, I'm using this same ring and pinion and my pinion seal develops a leak. All I have to do is I remove the pinion nut, pull off the flange, install the seal, put the pinion flange back on and tighten the nut down till it stops. With a typical crush sleeve, you have to like count the number of turns and have to be very, very careful that you're getting the exact same amount of preload on the bearings. Because this solid spacer does not move, in the case of service of a pinion bearing, all you do is tighten the nut up until it's tight, until the nut stops, because you haven't changed the distance here because it's fixed with shims. Okay, so for final assembly, make sure you put your pinion bearing in, put your oil slinger in, put your seal back on the outside, and then I'm going to go ahead and put the pinion in. Make sure you guys use a little bit of oil on the bearings just to pre-lube this stuff as you're putting everything together. So I'm going to go ahead and get my pinion flange kind of slid into place just like that. So when you're setting your pinion preload, just make sure you're using a brand new pinion nut for final assembly. Maybe put some extra Loctite on it just for some cheap insurance, and then obviously go through and double check to make sure you're good to go on your pinion preload. Once you have your pinion preload straightened out, it's going to be the exact same thing as what we did during mock-up. So you're going to go ahead and put the differential and the carrier in place using the correct shims that you selected during the mock-up process. All right, guys, so I got this thing wrestled back up into place. Let's check out the backlash real quick. So I'm seeing about 8 thousandths there. I tested it like 3 or 4 different places on this ring gear, and guys, it's on the tight end of the spec, but you know what? I'm gonna let it ride there at 8. So I was shooting for 10, but kind of overshot 10 and went at 8. So it is what it is. So yeah, I understand what I have here is probably on the tight end of the specification, but the thing is, guys, the shims that come in this kit that I got from Ford, they don't have any shims in the kit that are smaller than about 12 thousandths of an inch. And for me to make a 2 thousandths backlash change on this ring and pinion, I would need a shim that's like 2 thousandths thick, and the thinnest one in the kit is a 12. So I could sit here and chase my tail all day long trying to figure out, you know, that 2 thousandths, but the reality of the situation is what I have here is within Ford specification. So I'm gonna roll with it. If it makes noise, well, I'll come back in here and fix it. It is what it is. So the only thing really left to do is gonna be run a gear pattern. And if you guys have went through and ran your gear patterns before you did final assembly, you should pretty much know how this gear pattern is gonna look before you put paint on anything. So I'm gonna take a second here, paint up some teeth, and I'm probably gonna take a pattern reading in like 3 locations, the same way I did with the backlash. Take it at a couple different locations in case there's any variation in the ring gear that you're dealing with. So now that I have final assembly done, you can see I ran a couple different gear patterns on this ring and pinion to make sure that, you know, I'm still good to go on my tooth engagement, and I am. So I'm gonna continue reassembling everything. So I can bolt my brakes back on, I can put my diff cover back on with a fresh gasket, I can then install fresh oil in the new differential assembly, and then I can do my brake in. Guys, I don't have a lot of feedback for you, unfortunately, as far as brake in is concerned, mostly because it's February. I live in Ohio, and this car isn't gonna move for probably another 2 months until at least April. So as far as the break-in procedure is concerned, this is what I'm gonna do, but I haven't actually executed it yet due to my weather conditions in Northern Ohio. So what I would do for a break-in is simply drive the vehicle around town, conservative speeds, you know, let's say less than 50 miles an hour, stop and go traffic, drive it for 15 to 20 minutes, and then just let it sit. Because what you're gonna find here is until these bearings get seated, until you have a good wear pattern established in the ring and pinion, this differential is actually gonna run very, very hot. And once you establish some wear in the bearings and the ring gear and the pinion, you'll start seeing that temperature come down, and then at that point you can do sustained, long distances at high speeds. So my recommendation is run the vehicle around town 15 to 20 minutes. After that, let it sit for an hour and just keep repeating that procedure. So you're gonna run it for 15 to 20 minutes, let it sit for an hour or so, let it cool back down, run it for 15 to 20 minutes, let it cool for an hour or so. And you're just gonna do that over multiple days. And eventually, once you have 500 miles on the differential, at that point is when you should sort of consider it broken in. What I would do at that point, once you get 500 miles on it, you're gonna go ahead and change your fluid to whatever fluid you ultimately wanna use. As far as break-in's concerned, guys, I would use the cheapest stuff you can get your hands on, because over the course of 500 miles, you're not gonna see any tangible benefit to running a synthetic versus a conventional, and a conventional is probably gonna be about half the price. So because you're changing it so soon, I don't think you need to spend the extra money on a synthetic. As far as what gear oil I recommend, I personally like using like a 85 140 or a 75 140. I like a little bit thicker differential lube. I don't think there's any huge downside to using a thicker lubricant in a differential versus using 80/90. Again, that's gonna mostly come down to personal preference. If you guys wanna use synthetic, use synthetic. If you wanna use conventional, use conventional. What you're gonna find is the guys that run conventional and change it more frequently tend to have just as good a result as somebody that uses a synthetic lubricant and changes it at a longer interval. So it really comes down to how often you want to change the fluid. At the end of the day, you really can't, it's kind of like changing your motor oil. You can't change the fluid in a differential too often. It's not really going to cause any issues changing it more than what it's recommended. So guys, that's what I have for this video. I will have links down in the description to all the different tools that I used in this video, as well as some of the parts I used here if you guys are interested. If you guys are doing a Ford 8.8 like I am, I'll have links to all that stuff. As always, guys, if you guys like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content, go down and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.